Good day and welcome to ETH 418. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Sarah Anderson, who is a technical writer and is teaching a similar course at Carleton University. Sarah, can you tell me what the course you're teaching?
Sure. It's a course that we've run for every program in engineering, the undergrads, for a long time. It's a project-based course where people write a proposal, a technical report, do presentations, and give explanations. And the audience for this course this year, the students who are the first audience, captive audience, are multimedia and design students, which is new for me this year. So I'm learning about video games, but the same kinds of things.
And our topic for today is audience. We'll be talking about different audiences that you might be faced as a writer, both as a student and then in your professional career. And in terms of professional career, we'll talk a little bit about what you might be faced with as an academic writer versus a consulting or some sort of a professional scientist. Before we do though, I have a few things that I'd like to ask you about. I know you've got some unique insight. You've got, just for the benefit of our viewers, you've got a BA in math and German, an MA in linguistics, and a BSc in environmental science. And you've got years of working as a technical writer. So you've got lots of great experience to share. And I guess just in general, which of those degrees did you find most useful in terms of being a writer?
Being a writer, probably the linguistics, because I also did a diploma in technical writing, but yeah, actually maybe none of them in terms of being a writer. That's fair. I think it's the workplace experience. One of the most valuable experiences I had was going to a user conference for a company I was working for, and we were allowed to do user testing, and it was in the days where you still printed manuals, and we did this test, and we gave them the document, the printed guide, and we'd made this amazing quick reference card for installation, and then you had the installation CD, and we gave them the whole box, and they took the box out, they took the CD, and they took the manual, and they threw our beautiful card away. and and that kind of user testing and thinking about how watching people use information has been the most valuable, more than any academic knowledge. Humbling, but important.
For me, it's something similar. It's having written on the job for many years, and it's also very humbling to have somebody edit your work. And so I've taken a couple of technical writing courses in my academic career. My background is in chemistry, so I'm definitely not a writer by trade, but having had many reports of mine edited by professional editors has really helped me a lot. And it is really a lot of practice and a lot of trying over and over to make your words as concise as possible.
And a scientific background really helps with writing. If you think, well, with professional writing at least, maybe artistic writing, maybe not, maybe. But although I know a lot of brilliant writers who are scientists, but it's a problem, and you treat it, if you know how to deal with problem solving in a methodical way, then you know how to approach writing. And that's what I try to do with my course, and it sounds like what you try to do with yours.
So far in my course, we've focused mainly on grammar and mechanics, and now we're getting into what I think is the most interesting part, which is really trying to reach our audience, really trying to reach the people that we're trying to write to and to help them understand what we're trying to say. And before I started recording, you said a few things that were really interesting, and I'm going to ask you to speak to again. One of them was around the phrase "dumb it down" or "assume the audience knows nothing." You had some nice insight around what you think of that frame of mind.
I've always hated that frame of mind. Because as soon as you think the people you're talking to are stupid, you start doing stupid things, and you write stupid things, and you just you need to have respect for your audience as experts in whatever they do, and then it becomes a much more rational conversation from on your side as well as understanding on theirs. And it's also quite apart from the attitude and the respect that I feel is important in communication in any kind of conversation. It's not very practical advice because you can't eliminate all assumptions. Like, how far do you go? You know, do you assume that they don't understand that water freezes in the winter if you're writing it in the summer? Like, eliminating all assumptions is not helpful advice. It's yeah.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I wanted to start with that because we'll be talking about different audiences and how there are some things that we will write differently if you're writing for an academic journal versus a document that's going out to the general public. But I just wanted to get it right up front that that is not one of the things that we'll be recommending is to dumb it down. So there are different ways we can make our documents more readable and more universal or accessible, as it's said, but that's not one of them. One thing that we might want to do, though, is define a lot of terms differently depending on who our audience is. And there are a few different ways of doing that. So we can have a call out on the side of the page. We can have a glossary or a separate section. And you have some views on which of those is most suitable for various audiences?
Yeah, well, it depends on the audience. The one thing I do say that is that nobody actually, like, professors have to read your whole thing because we're paid to read all of it. Once you go out into the workplace, the only person who's maybe going to read every comma is the lawyer, and they might even not. They might delegate part of that. So you have to assume that people are mostly not going to read stuff. So you put it where they can find it. So it depends what they're going to look at. Glossaries take people away from the main thing. Explanations can be too long. Looking at what has worked in your field already is maybe a good start. The best is to have the explanation right there, but be skippable for the person who doesn't need it. And call outs do that really well. Parentheses do that really well if it's just a word or two. A picture does it really well. It depends on what it is.
So as students, according to my textbook that I've been distributing, there are really 4 different unique audience members for a student. And so the student has to worry about generally educated people, specialists in their field, their instructor, and their peers. And that's relatively simple. Most of those people that I had mentioned are assumed to be educated in terms of peers having about the same level of education as themselves. Their instructors know very well what they're reading. Other specialists and generally educated people are, a relatively straightforward audience to write toward. Looking forward into somebody's career, though, that will almost certainly diversify as a scientist, especially in the field that we're looking at, which is earth and environmental science, where almost everybody in the general public does care about the earth and environmental science that affects them. Any project that's happening in their vicinity, the general public will want to read. And so we have a much more diverse set of audience members that we need to write to. You've got some tools and techniques for looking at what are the needs of the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are really broad audiences, but and sometimes if you write it down, it can look overwhelming. You've got to write for the people who are who've been part of the project team for 10 years. You've got to write for the newcomers. You've got to write for regulators. You've got to write for the newspaper journalist that's going to show up. And so what the first thing that I try to do is narrow it down. Not that you don't have to write for all those people, because you do, and they have to succeed, and you have to know what it is they want to get out of it, as well as what you want to communicate. You have to know what they want to hear. But it's a good idea to narrow it down so that you're only at worst looking at one audience at a time, and at best you've decided you can write for 2 or 3 of them, and the rest will understand that that's who you're writing for.
And I'd like to just refer to an online textbook that I've linked to on on my course blog site. And so it has some questions that we would normally ask when we're about to embark on writing a document. So who is my target audience? That's the first on this list. It's going to affect how we write. What are their perspectives? What is my goal? And then what is my reader's goal? Do you have any other questions that you would ask, or any more sort of detail about these questions that you would normally look at?
I might look at more detail depending, I might look at their perspectives in more detail as I get really into the document, but as a general set of questions, that's what it covers. You want to know what you really want to be clear on what you want to accomplish, and then you want to know why they're reading it. And then the other things fall into place.
So we looked at a tool that you use for identifying the primary audience. And before we started recording, we started building a table. I thought we might go to that table now and kind of walk through how one might identify the primary audience in something that's fairly complex and multidisciplinary, like an environmental impact assessment.
Okay, I'll share the screen so we get back to that table.
So before we start typing, though, just for the students watching this, I'll kind of walk through a little bit about what's here. And this relates to a lot of work that I've done, and I think most likely about a third of our class will end up being environmental impact assessment practitioners or contaminated sites assessors, or something that's fairly similar to this type of work. One consideration in this work is that it's very multidisciplinary. And so what we've done is chosen a case study here of a geochemist who is writing a geochemistry section of an environmental impact assessment. And we've looked at some of the key elements of that impact assessment. This person is assessing an abandoned nickel mine, which has acid rock drainage, shown here as ARD. The mitigation that the geochemist is proposing is to blend the materials so that we get neutralization from any carbonates, and the site is on Lake Huron. And so on the column on the left, we have all of the different audiences that this person has to consider. So the first is other geochemists who will be working on the same document or who might share information or data, but they are essentially on that project team. Next, we have other specialists in an environmental impact assessment or some other multidisciplinary type of study like this. We have lots of different related specialists who share information. So for example, if the geochemist is predicting that this acid rock drainage will run off into Lake Huron, there will be a fisheries biologist who needs to assess what that might do to the fish, as well as a number of other specialists. Next, there will be a senior, and that senior person will be a specialist in the same field, and that person will be responsible for signing off on the quality of the product and making sure it meets the standards of the company that they both work for before it goes to the client. And the next is the client, and that client will usually be some sort of an industrial proponent who wants to build something or construct something or clean something up or do something that has some impact on the environment. And that client will read the environmental impact assessment thinking that the assessment needs to have considered their project as closely as possible to the design and to the intent of the project, particularly if it's controversial or if it's going to require a high level of regulatory oversight. The project will be reviewed by lawyers. The lawyers will be looking for any risks to the approval or risks to the client. And they won't be looking so much at the technical details, but does this pose some sort of a reputational or financial or regulatory risk to the client? Once it's past these hurdles, the assessment will go to a number of different parties at once. So it'll go to the general public, to regulators, and Indigenous communities. And each of these specific stakeholders has different legal types of considerations. The general public might hire third-party reviewers. Regulators might review it themselves, or they might hire third-party reviewers. Indigenous communities will almost always hire third-party reviewers. And the third-party reviewers are going to be looking in fine detail at any technical detail of the assessment, making sure that anything that could possibly affect their client, which would be the general public or the Indigenous communities, has been well accounted for. Depending on the profile or the triggers in the environmental impact assessment, it may then go to an expert panel. The expert panel is ultimately tasked with deciding whether the project is in the public interest, and the assessment will then go on the public record on the government's website, usually, where it can be read by future readers for many years. So we have all of these different types of audiences. We can't possibly consider 10 different audiences at once. It's just not something we can do meaningfully. And so you've got this nice tool that will first help us narrow down different types of audiences or see if one audience will cover each other off. So how do we go about doing that?
So it's really simple. You just go pair at a time and you say, if I write for Jerry, will Sarah understand? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe not. If it's about geochemistry, probably not. If I write it for Sarah, will Jerry understand? And the answer is yes. So that means we can cross Jerry off the list of someone we write for primarily. Doesn't mean we cross him off the list of audiences. We'll go back and do a review to make sure we've covered everything he needs. But if we write a geochemistry explanation for Sarah, for me, then it's going to be enough for Jerry as well. So we go pair by pair. So with this list, I can't remember where we started, but let's just start at the top. If we write for the other geochemists, will the other specialists understand everything? If you focus it just at the other people on your project team in your field, are the other specialists going to understand everything you write?
Well, I could look at this list and go with the level of detail that each group will require from the writer. And so if you've written so that your senior sign-off will be satisfied, you would almost certainly satisfy other geochemists. So we can close that group off.
So they're okay with sign-off, with senior?
Yep.
So we can group them with the senior people. Okay, other specialists, the same thing. If the senior person is okay. Is that true though, if the senior person is in your field?
Well, actually, the other specialists will be covered off by third-party reviewers. And in fact, the seniors and other geochemists would also be covered by third-party reviewers, because the third-party reviewers are looking for all sorts of really fine details. And in fact, part of the review that the senior does before sign-off is considering, will this document meet the requirements of third-party reviewers who will be reading this document after it goes out to the public. And so that third-party reviewer actually covers off the first three types of audience.
Okay. And how about the expert panel? If you've written for the third-party reviewers now, are the expert panel people covered? Have you got enough for them too?
That's a good question. And I think I would say no, but if we go back to the regulators are looking for public interest. They're also looking for technical details, but they're really looking to make sure that the proponent has made the right commitments around mitigation. The expert panel would be looking for both of those things. So if the regulators and the third-party reviewers have covered their needs, the expert panel would be covered by the combination of those two, which is...
Okay. So let's make these guys bold because they don't look like they're going away.
No, they're
And
pretty important.
oops, I said okay before. So they're okay with third party plus the regulators. Okay, so we've got rid of a bunch of rows already. Let me just make some rows at the bottom here and we can move people down. I'm going to move all these guys down while you look at the others and think if there's anyone else that we can throw to the bottom.
So I think I can group a couple of them.
Okay.
So In terms of what the readers would be looking for from the technical sense, in terms of what they might be looking for in, say, a geochemistry component or a fisheries component of an EIA, the general public and the Indigenous communities would be similar. Now, Indigenous communities have special rights right in law, but that relates more to consultation and other parts of the EIA. So strictly speaking, with regards to a technical document, they could be considered the same audience.
Right. So because they have special rights, we might say it this way, that if we've written for the Indigenous community in this section, the general audience is covered.
That's a good way to put it. Yep.
Yeah. So let's throw the general public out to the bottom, not out, just to the bottom. Okay, so that's good. How about the future readers?
So the future readers, I don't think there's a way we can plan to accommodate them. And in fact, in an EIA, I don't think we would try. I think it's something that we would consider that is out there and that our work will be on the public record forever. But I don't think it's possible to know who they are or what they might be looking for. It could be anything from other consultants trying to look at a competitive advantage by reading your work. It could be other community members from other projects trying to find out, how did this project go 20 years ago and how will my project go? I mean, there's just really no limit to what this reader could be looking for. And I don't think there's any way we could plan for that. So
I think I would add to that is that maybe often when you're doing an environmental impact assessment, then there's been some discussion of it in the news or in the media, or some understanding of the problem. And it may be that in the whole report, there's some background section about the issue or the community or things like that, that is clear to everybody now that won't be clear in 10 years. But yeah, apart from that, it could be anyone, and there are probably other geochemists and there are other clients and other lawyers and other communities.
Well, you've actually reminded me that I've missed an audience group, and I think maybe we could write it for completeness, but as we'll see shortly, they'll be covered by another group. So we need to consider the media. A lot of large EIAs end up in the media, but that is something that the lawyers will be looking for. So if we've covered off our lawyers, or our lawyers have covered off our review, the media will be implicitly covered there.
Yeah. Like you might have a media person in your organization that will go through and look for things to point the media at. But in terms of the content that you're writing as the scientist, they should be covered by those other things.
Yeah, that's definitely something that the legal review will be looking for, is any sort of risk. And so why don't we go to the lawyers? So they'll review for risk. That's really what they do. They look at any risk to the client. So regulatory risk, financial risk, any risk of environmental catastrophe, any risk of something getting out in the media that makes their clients look bad. And it's a fairly specific review, but it is something that if we haven't written with them in mind, we'll have to be doing a lot of edits down the road.
Yeah. And something that I remember from I worked on environmental assessments for a Calgary company for a while, so mostly for pipeline routes. And what the legal review and also the senior reviewers were looking for was overbroad claims and statements, and that there's linguistic flags for those that you might talk about later in the course. So risk, but specifically risk because you said something too broadly.
We've actually got another guest speaker coming to talk about expert witness later near the end of the course. So that'll be an interesting topic.
So can we get rid of any of these others? I think maybe not.
No. So the client will be very specifically looking at concordance or alignment with their project, and no other group will be doing that. The lawyers are looking at risk. Regulators are looking at the public interest broadly, and Indigenous communities will be looking at their rights and how their rights are impacted, particularly the rights of resource development affecting their ability to hunt, fish, and trap is often what their needs are specified as in an EIA. It's a lot more complicated than that, obviously, but with each of these 5 groups, they've got fairly distinct needs or wants from an environmental impact assessment.
Yeah. So we probably need to keep them and think about them as audience. Now let's just run through quickly. How much do the lawyers know about ARD, and how much does the client know about ARD, and how much do they need to know to understand what you're going to write?
That really varies. A small company might not have anybody on staff who's familiar with that, whereas a large mining company would almost certainly have some specialists on staff. And I guess this is an abandoned nickel mine, so in all likelihood, the client would know quite a bit about it. This is a big topic, and they'd almost certainly have a small group of people who have some expertise in this area.
So I put in, while we were waiting, I'm figuring the third-party reviewers would know quite a lot, because that's why they're reviewers, that they're technical experts.
Oh, okay, perfect.
But how much will the lawyers know about?
Definitely not a lot of the technical details. They'll know about the topic broadly. They'll know that it is a big risk, but they wouldn't necessarily know the chemical formulas or the technical specifications of what we need to assess and how it's assessed. They would just know that it's a big issue and that it needs to be properly considered.
Okay. And the regulators?
Quite a lot again. This is a big issue. Most agencies would have some specialized staff who would deal with this.
Okay. And the Indigenous community would be more like the lawyers, maybe?
More like the lawyers. This one again depends. In some communities that have been near large developments for many years, they would know quite a bit. But in the case of a new project, they would typically not know very much. But I would say sense of the risks, but not the technical specifications is good enough. So that's good. So we've actually almost got 2 groups now. That's nice.
For this field. So
for this particular topic.
Yeah, for this topic. We maybe don't need to go through all of them, but there is a big difference between, there can be a big difference between knowledge that you've got from a project base and knowledge that you've got from a formal background. So if you've got a formal background in chemistry, then you've gone through an awful lot of chemistry and it's been pretty systematic in how you've learned it. If you've learned your chemistry from being involved in 3 big chemistry projects, then you might know massive amounts about the things that came up in that project, but have enormous gaps at really basic levels and other things. So it's risky to assume that someone, even if they've had a lot of experience with a similar project, you might want to scan through, if you're basing your decisions about what to explain, you might want to scan through what the big issues were in that similar project, just to make sure that there aren't any whole new areas in this one.
Another complication there is that the community will be comprised of a very broad range of knowledge, from very little to a lot, depending on how long the project has been there. And often, resource development projects will have impact benefit agreements with the communities. And so we'll have people working on site. And so obviously they'll know just as much as anybody else working on site. And so they'll be highly informed over years. And
maybe abandoned nickel mines and the kinds of things that happen with those, and blending materials, there might be different answers, but they're similar. That's 3 areas of technical knowledge that you'd want to sketch out. Knowledge of the site is a different kind of knowledge, maybe.
Yeah. So if we're talking about Lake Huron, the receiving environment, it would definitely be different from the level of knowledge. So, for example, a client would typically not know as much about the lake and the receiving environment, although again, they might have specialized staff. If the staff have been working there for some time, it really depends if it's a new site or an existing site. But typically they'd be more informed about what's going on site than, say, the surrounding environment.
Yeah.
Lawyers, probably not too much in the way of you know, the lake dynamics and sort of the finer details around how a lake works. Third-party reviewers a lot. Typically, they'll know as much or more than sometimes than the practitioners or anybody else, depending on where those reviewers are from. It's not uncommon to have a third-party reviewer hired specifically because that person has done a lot of work, like maybe a PhD thesis or something on that specific lake or receiving environment. So they can be very high in the knowledge in this category.
Okay. I'm going to say 4 and then it's shorter. Okay. And the regulators?
Also can be quite high. It varies again, but typically there will be specialists within the environmental, the environment department, depending on which province or if it's federal. But typically there will be some specialists with quite a high level of knowledge of a given receiving environment.
Okay.
And then the Indigenous communities, typically their knowledge is very high, especially if it's anywhere that is within their traditional territory. They'll know a long history of that lake, not necessarily, you know, the chemistry right down to the specific concentration, but they'll know the general ecology and the history, and they'll have a much deeper understanding than maybe any of the other groups.
Yeah. Okay. So that would already affect, looking at this, you know, there are going to be things you need to say about ARD and about the mines probably. You need to have a short form and you need to have some supporting information for anyone who wants to know a little bit more. Because in this one, I would guess that you would want to target the explanation at the people that know quite a lot and then provide a supporting explanation for the technical terms. Would that be right?
And would you say it's most effective to have a separate standalone document? I mean, sometimes EIAs have plain language summaries. I'm kind of surprised they don't all have them. But do you think that's a good way to go for that?
I think they don't all have them because of budget, but
Probably.
that could work, except in the general public and the Indigenous community that stands for them. They might want the supporting information more integrated with the technical piece so that they don't feel like it, so that the connection is really clear. So it would depend on the level of comfort in your general public people, such as the local communities, and level of trust, really. Because the more separate the plain language summary is, the better it has, the plain language summarizer has to be, I guess.
Now, one of the nice parts about environmental impact assessment is that 3 of these groups are consulted fairly heavily, and that's the client, the regulators, and the Indigenous communities. So those 3 parties are given quite a bit of consultation in terms of how would you like to see the assessment done, what would you like to see in the assessment, and so there is an opportunity to engage directly with those stakeholders and audiences in terms of tailoring the document. The other 2 groups, the lawyers and the third-party reviewers, as far as I've seen, would never see the document until it's complete. So at that point, now you've got to sort of foresee what they're going to want. So there's a bit of a difference there in terms of being able to query your audience or not.
And for the lawyers, you might almost want to find a solid and trustworthy explanation of ARD, if there's something that exists on government sites already or on an academic site already. But if not, you could include a call out or an explanation box, like you said.
Great. Well, I think that sort of covers this tool and the ability to condense our list of audience members from, I think we started with over 10 down to effectively 2 or 3 for each category, which is extremely helpful.
Yeah. And what I would suggest that you then do, especially at the beginning, you know, after you've written your 50th environmental assessment, you can just do this and write. But if you write for the third-party reviewer in this case, then write it just for them, and then go back and look at what you've written and say, okay, are the lawyers okay? What do I need to add for the lawyers? And decide how to add specifically for the lawyers, and then go and say, okay, what do I need to write for the Indigenous and other in the local communities, and add things specifically for them. So do it in 3 separate passes. Even though we've narrowed it down from 11 to 5, don't try and write for 5 people all at once when you're beginning. Pick one and then do a pass and add, and do another pass and add. It will be shorter and better in the well, no, it will be shorter. And your senior person will be happier, and you want your senior person happy.
Everybody will be happier with a shorter document.
Right.
Okay, well, thanks. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about in terms of audience?
The only thing I would maybe add is that you might draw yourself a little bit of a sketch, especially if you're a visual person. Draw, label something, whatever you think you need to talk about for abandoned mines or about the site, and label it with some of the key terms. And then every now and then you can do a check to make sure you haven't used synonyms or used technical terms or that you've decided are out of scope for this audience. So you can use it as a reality check that you set up at the beginning.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for your advice and your time. I really appreciate it. I hope my students have learned something about narrowing down audiences. I've absolutely learned a lot about doing that. I've never actually used that tool before today, so I think that would have been helpful to me 20 years ago. So I appreciate the lesson now.
Yeah.
And I could see myself doing that in the future, actually, with different types of documents.
I've been using it for 15 years, and I still do it layer by layer, because otherwise I get carried away. Especially if I find a topic interesting, it's good to have a framework to check yourself against. So yeah, I hope they find it useful.
Well, thanks. Well, I'll end our shared lecture there.